Ladies, gentlemen, bounders, rotters, cads, and ghastly blighters, Pride and Prejudice was published 210 years ago. What can the modern woman and modern gentleman learn from this masterpiece? Grab your whiskey bottle, grab your cigars, and grab your snuff box. We're going in. Jane Austen was a mere teenager, a mere slip of a girl, 18 or 20, when she wrote Lady Susan, about a sexual predator who uses her intelligence and charm to manipulate, betray, and abuse her friends, family, and lovers. But if a woman can manipulate, betray, and abuse her lovers, friends, and family, so too can a gentleman. And every day the news is full of horror stories of women who are becoming ensnared with terrible men. In fact, according to the United Nations, nearly 50,000 women and girls are killed every single year by their intimate partners or family members. Jane Austen was an incredibly astute observer of human nature. The greatness of her literary masterpiece, Pride and Prejudice, rests on her stunning awareness of human nature. She understood how thoughts create habits, habits create character, and character creates destiny. In Pride and Prejudice, youngest daughter Lydia is deceived and manipulated by the villainous Mr. Wickham, described as one of the most worthless young men in all of Great Britain. A villain, a rogue, a scoundrel, worst of all, a bally old rotter.
In the famous opening chapter, Mrs. Bennet wants her 5 daughters to get married. Her husband barely gives a damn. He says they have none of them much to recommend them. They are all silly and ignorant. She asks, "How can you abuse your own daughters? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion for my poor nerves." He mocks her, saying, "I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these last 20 years. He openly mocks his wife and ridicules his own daughters, the rotten bounder. Pride and Prejudice tells us she was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. The business of her life is to get her daughters married.
And when in social situations, rather than keep her mouth shut and be thought a fool, she boldly opens it to the horizon and removes all doubt.
Hardly the model of a happy marriage. What led this paragon of parental responsibility to marry this intellectual giant? But what effect will this have upon their children? Let us find out. Jane Austen writes, "Had Elizabeth's opinion been drawn from her own family, she could not have formed a very pleasing picture of conjugal felicity or domestic comfort. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty, and that appearance of good humour which youth and beauty generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. What a silly man! He married a beauty, forgetting to check if she had a brain. Respect, esteem, and confidence had disappeared forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. To his wife he was very little otherwise indebted, other than that her ignorance and folly had contributed to his amusement. So his only thoughts of his wife were of how her stupidity made him laugh. Hardly a loving husband. With such unsuitable parents, it's no wonder that youngest daughter Lydia is about to have her life ruined by a rotten bounder. She goes to Brighton, where she may indulge herself to her heart's content with an entire regiment of licentious young officers. The saucy little fox. Austen writes, "In Lydia's imagination, a visit to Brighton comprised every possibility of earthly happiness. She saw, with a creative eye of fancy, the streets of that gay bathing place covered with officers. She saw herself as the object of attention to tens and of scores of them, at present unknown." A vivid imagination you have there, Lydia. Gentlemen, beware. Lydia is on the prowl. she saw before her all the glories of the camp, its tents stretched forth in beauteous uniformity of line, crowded with the young and the gay, and dazzling with scarlet. To complete the view, she saw herself seated beneath a tent, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. Elizabeth knows that Lydia's complete inability to restrain herself will result in not just the ruin of herself and her own life, but the ruin of the family's reputation as well. She goes to her father. "If you are aware," said Elizabeth, "of the very great disadvantage to us all, which must arise from the public notice of Lydia's imprudent and unguarded manner, nay, which has already arisen from it, I am sure you would judge differently in the affair." Elizabeth tries to convince her father to prevent Lydia from going out and disgracing herself and the family. Naturally, he doesn't give a damn. Her father merely suggests that Elizabeth is a little bit jealous. Elizabeth says to him, "Indeed you are mistaken. I have no such injuries to resent. Our importance, our respectability in the world, must be affected by the wild volatility, the assurance and disdain of all restraint which mark Lydia's character. Excuse me, but I must speak clearly. If you, my dear father, will not take the trouble of checking her exuberant spirits, and teaching her that her present pursuits are not to be the business of her life, she will soon be beyond the reach of amendment." When Elizabeth mentions Lydia's exuberant spirits, she means she'll be very easily led to have sex with one or more of the officers, may become pregnant, and then her reputation will be ruined. Her character will be fixed. She will, at 16, be the most determined flirt that ever made herself and her family ridiculous. A flirt, too, in the worst and meanest degree of flirtation. Elizabeth is saying she will end up in bed with one or more of the officers. Word will get around, and the disgrace will ruin her reputation. A flirt, too, in the worst and meanest degree of flirtation, without any attraction beyond youth and a tolerable person. Jane Austen uses almost identical words describing Mr. Bennet's initial view of Mrs. Bennet. Her youth and beauty had given her the appearance of being a tolerable person, thus blinding him to her empty mind and all her flaws. Elizabeth goes on, "And from the ignorance and emptiness of her mind, wholly unable to ward off any portion of that universal contempt which her rage for admiration will excite." So Elizabeth is saying that Lydia's ignorance and empty mind, combined with her rage for admiration, will make people view her with contempt wherever she goes, just as Mr. Bennet views Mrs. Bennet with contempt. In this danger, Kitty is also comprehended. Kitty is a second youngest sister. Elizabeth says she will follow wherever Lydia leads, vain, ignorant, idle, and absolutely uncontrolled. Oh, my dear father, can you not suppose it possible that they will not be censured and despised wherever they are known, and that their sisters will not be often involved in a disgrace? Party stuff, what? Lydia is about to throw her reputation away, just as her father threw the family's future away. We see very clearly in this next chapter how Mr. Bennet's attraction to beauty ruined his life. Now it's going to ruin the lives of his daughters. Jane Austen writes, Mr. Bennet had very often wished, before this period of his life, that instead of spending his whole income, he had laid by an annual sum for the better provision of his children and of his wife if she survived him. The problem the Bennet family face is that their property is entailed to a male relative. Upon Mr. Bennet's death, the house and all the lands go to one of his relatives, Mr. Collins. His wife and his daughters will be homeless. When Mr. and Mrs. Bennet had married, they assumed they would have a son. If they were to give birth to a son, then the property would pass to the son in the event of Mr. Bennet's death. Jane Austen writes, when first the Bennets were married, economy was held to be perfectly useless, for of course they were to have a son. 5 daughters successively entered the world, but yet the son was to come, and Mrs. Bennet, for many years after Lydia's birth, had been certain that he would. This event had been at last despaired of, but by then it was too late to be saving. Mrs. Bennet had no turn for economy, and her husband's love of independence had alone prevented them from exceeding their income, so neither one of them considered the possibility that they might not give birth to a son. And now, due to that oversight, when Mr. Bennet dies, the family stands to lose everything. That's a bit crap, isn't it? Austen writes, Elizabeth, however, had never been blind to the impropriety of her father's behaviour as a husband. Always seen it with pain, but respecting his abilities, and grateful for his affectionate treatment of herself, she endeavoured to forget what she could not overlook, and to banish from her thoughts that continual breach of conjugal obligation and decorum in exposing his wife to the contempt of her own children was so highly reprehensible. But she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantages which must attend the children of so unsuitable a marriage, nor ever been so fully aware of the evils arising from so ill-judged a direction of talents which, if rightly used, might at least have preserved the respectability of his daughters, even if incapable of enlarging the mind of his wife. We learn of Elizabeth that thinking of her family's situation was a constant source of vexation and regret, and in the unhappy defects of her family, a subject of yet heavier chagrin. They were hopeless of remedy. Her father, contented with laughing at them, would never exert himself to restrain the wild giddiness of his youngest daughters, and her mother, with manners so far from right herself, was entirely insensible of the evil. Elizabeth had frequently united with Jane, the eldest sister, in an endeavour to check the imprudence of Catherine and Lydia, but while they were supported by their mother's indulgence, what chance could there be of improvement? Catherine, the second youngest, weak-spirited, irritable, and completely under Lydia's guidance, had been always affronted by their advice, and Lydia, self-willed and careless, would scarcely give them a hearing. They were ignorant, idle, and vain. While there was an officer in Meryton, they would flirt with him, and while Meryton was within a walk of Longbourn, they would be going there forever.
So there it is, ladies, gentlemen, and bally old rotters, a psychological masterclass from Jane Austen. The foolish parents' bad marriage leads to foolish daughters who will make bad life decisions.
Throughout much of the 1700s, and throughout Jane Austen's life, there were hundreds of conduct books written by men and women giving advice on how women ought to be educated, what they ought to believe, and how they ought to act. The great proto-feminist Mary Wollstonecraft railed against much of this advice in her 1787 pamphlet, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, and in her 1791 masterpiece, Vindication on the Rights of Women. We will speak a great deal about this era, and the very great Mary Wollstonecraft, and the early feminists in an upcoming video.
Headbutt that subscribe button and give at least 10 likes. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Bugger off now. Cheerio.